Thank you very much for coming this evening. And I'm Nigel Freeman, Director of the African American Fine Art Department here at Swann. We are very excited, thrilled to have Barkley Hendricks here this evening. And just as an introduction, I'm going to tell our audience a little bit about some of your accomplishments. A little bit of a bio might be in order. Barkley Hendricks was born and raised in Philadelphia. He graduated from Simon Gratz High School and attended the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts from 1963 through 1967, and then attended Yale University from 1970 to 72, where he was awarded a BFA and an MFA. And Barkley has had numerous solo exhibitions in national galleries and museums, beginning in 1970 with your first solo exhibition at Kenmore Galleries, and had many other exhibitions, including at the Student Museum, the Greenville County Museum, and recently, in 2008, Trevor Schoonmaker, who's we're honored to have here as well, Furious, organized a major exhibition of your work, Barkley L. Hendricks, Birth of the Cool, which attracted critical and popular acclaim, which was long overdue. And the exhibition traveled from the National Museum to the Studio Museum here in New York, to the Santa Monica Museum of Art, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and finally the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston. And your work today is found in many permanent collections of museums, including the National Gallery, including the National Museum, of course, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, of course, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Tate Modern, and other recent institutions like the Virginia Museum of Fine Art. And Swann has also been honored to be part of your recent history. We were the first auction house to sell a work by Barkley Hendricks that was a large figure piece, and that was acquired by the Sheldon Museum of Art in 2009. And Barkley is represented here in New York by Jack Shaman Gallery. So, welcome, being comfortable. We're talking about your work as an artist and what brought you to painting? What was the spark that made you decide you had to become an artist?
First of all, let me thank you all for coming out, because you could be somewhere else. And honored that you're here tonight to address the question of my involvement with paint. I would say my high school experience helped me to think about movement towards higher education. I had a teacher who went to Temple University, and she was pushing in that direction, but I didn't have the credits for that. And found out later it was just as well, because I went to the academy, and I found that the academy was a place that was a little bit more to my liking. And I felt that that experience sort of set the stage for trying to take it a bit further in terms of the area of education. And that's when Yale entered the picture. Yeah. But I feel that the Academy of Fine Arts helped set the stage, because there were situations that I had at Yale that I had to get them straightened out about.
Well, let's...
And the best thing about Yale is once you got in, they left you alone.
Well, let's look back at, if you don't mind, just before we go to Yale, tell us just a little bit about the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art experience. I mean, you wanted a classical training in fine arts and figurative painting?
Well, interestingly enough, earlier today we were talking about my experience with one of the teachers at the Academy of Fine Arts, and I gave him a little bit more information about how tough this particular painter professor was, and it was a man named Walter Stuempfig. And Walter Stuempfig was very hard edge, and he, to be very honest, I'm going to use some colorful language, he didn't take any shit from anybody. And there on many occasions I would get kicked out of class because, as I was telling Nigel earlier, Walter wasn't one of the modernists in terms of his paintings. And whenever he dealt with modernism or abstraction, he would let you know. And one particular time I brought 2 paintings to him, and if you saw the Brooklyn Museum show, you'll notice there are 2 different styles here. One is more geometric and one is a figure. The geometric images were basketballs that I like, and the other was a figure. Well, anyway, I brought these 2 paintings to Walter Stuempfig, and he looked at me and he pointed to the basketball piece and he says, "Turn that shit to the wall. It hurts my eyes. It reminds me of that goddamn French painter Leger." That was the kind of man he was.
That's not a bad thing to be insulted with, comparing you to Leger.
Well, the interesting part about that, several years ago, there was a large Leger, I think retrospective here in New York, and they had busts, depots and everything with Leger images on it, and Leger is remembered. Walter Stuempfig isn't.
That's true. Touche.
So
Well, yeah.
So anyway, but I treasured him because there are some lessons that I learned from him that set the stage for me dealing with the larger art world.
Well, it's the school of hard knocks, and I think as someone who's been through an MFA program, you need some kind of tough love from professors to get you prepared for the world outside the academy, and you went from kind of the academic or more classical school at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art to Yale University. And at Yale at the time, it was all about abstraction. 1970. I think you called them in one interview pourers, the people who poured and worked on the floor. What was that experience like?
Well, it's interesting because the very first night that I spent at Yale, it was a situation where I didn't get any sleep at all because they came down on me like a ton of bricks. The teaching of certain professors, one in particular, made it a point to try to push his philosophy. And
was that Joseph? Was Joseph Albers still teaching?
No, it was Al Held.
Ah.
And if you're familiar with Al Held,
we're going to name names this evening.
Oh yeah, well you have to. You got to provide the real deal here. So anyway, he would come into my studio with bogus dialogue, and I'm not going to sort of deal with any of the, how can I say, descriptions that I had to sort of lay out to him in terms of where he should go. But we didn't get along. And oddly enough, there's an article in L, Decor, dealing with the images that I have on display at the National Portrait Gallery. And on one page is the portrait I did of at Yale. Right at the bottom of it is a portrait done by Philip Pearlstein. Now, it's a painting that Philip Pearlstein did of Al Held and his wife. So it's a interesting bit of irony.
A reunion of sorts. Yes.
So, but I don't want to sort of paint a picture that Yale wasn't a great place to be, because there were people that I respect and love there. You know, Lester Johnson, Bernard Chait, Gabor Petity were inspirations and good to talk to. In fact, you were talking about Jason Wren and here. Lester Johnson and especially Bernard Chait were very much into the music that I loved.
Right.
And it made a great interaction to have them talk about what their loves were.
That's great. Yeah, that's nice to have a bond, and you had their support, and I think that must have been a very formative experience for you. You were already doing work that we kind of recognize today as Barkley Hendricks, and you painted. You learned how to paint very directly. You had a sort of economy to your work already in the simplification of the backgrounds, the use of acrylic paint. Was the acrylic and the Magna paint that came out in the 70s, was that something you experimented at Yale with?
Well, one of the areas of creativity that doesn't get enough coverage in terms of what I like doing, and that's being involved with the materials themselves. The quality of oil, the consistency of acrylic comes together and gives me the kind of quality that I like. For example, this is an oil and acrylic piece. The figure is oil and the background is acrylic. And a friend of mine who was very much involved with acrylic paint, we had a conversation one day, and I was saying how the oil that I was working on took forever to dry. So he said, why don't you use acrylic? So I started to use acrylic and found that it did exactly what I wanted to do, and helped to facilitate thinking beyond the finish point. Once I could layer on 2 or 3, 4 coats, I could see where I wanted to go with it, and if necessary, bring up the oil to an area of satisfaction that would give me what I would call a wet-dry effect. I hadn't seen this painting in a while, and if I had it, I would put another layer of new material, a new varnish on it, so that it would be a little bit more liquid, a little bit more reflective, so that it would contrast the acrylic with that wet-dry effect.
Yeah, well, the painting, the color you've accomplished here, this blue, has quite a depth to it, and the there's a richness in the blue that we struggled to match when we were color correcting the catalog. We did, I think, a very good job, but there's a richness in this blue that you don't see necessarily in acrylic painting of the time. There's a simplicity to it, but there's many colors in the blue that do resonate. And I think it's interesting for our audience to see how you worked out from the very preliminary drawing to developing the colors, bringing this out, and then when you chose the background color, was that a decision made based on your palette of the colors, or had you predetermined that you were going with blue? What was the thinking in your decision making?
There's a group of images which I call my limited palette work, like white on white, yellow on yellow, black on black. And this is obviously a blue on blue.
Right.
And Sergio was one of the students at Yale who thought of himself as a Latin lover of Yale's campus. Yeah. And he would float around and, tell me of his exploits. And so I got him to pose for me.
I think you said on the phone that he thought he was the star because he's got the star in his...
Oh, yeah. I mean, he's a brother who had an ego, and I liked it.
That's
so
great.
He wasn't ashamed, so
that's great.
I dug that.
And so tell us a little bit more. It's a thrill just to hear about the process and the inspiration. So Sergio was someone you kind of eyeballed and thought he came into the MFA program as a model. You worked with him in front of the canvas. Did you have many people pose for you? Did you take photographs? Tell us a little bit more about the process.
I was fortunate enough that I had a number of people come into my studio and pose for me. And the situation on many occasions, these were some characters. And there was one particular time when I did 3 guys, and actually one of the paintings is in the collection. I just met a curator from Cornell, and one of the paintings is in their collection, and the painting is called Down Home Taste. Mm. Well, you've heard of that commercial, Down Home Taste. Have you not?
Yeah.
All right. It was that Down Home Taste, and he was lighting up, and I did a painting of him lighting up. And anyway, I had another 2 paintings that were on the easel because I would work on 2 or 3 or 4 at a time. Well, anyway, he came to my studio to finish posing, and then he just said, hey, man, those 2 dudes were in jail. I just saw them. What happened? They had been, rounded up in one of New Haven's sweeps. And one of the guys in the painting was, how can I say, he would run errands for the Yale students. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. But he wouldn't come right back. And so I had these knocks on the door, like, have you seen Charles? I said, no. So I did a painting of Charles. It's a 5 by 6 painting with this man with a red long coat that's in the National Gallery. And it's called Sir Charles alias Willie Harris.
Yes.
You know who Willie Harris is? Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun. Willie Harris was the character that, if you remember, Sidney Poitier gave the guy the money to so he could spread it around so he can get the license. Well, as you know, Willie took the money and ran.
Yeah.
So that's why I call it, Sir Charles alias Willie Harris.
And you captured him in canvas before.
Well, he was, again, rather sartorial in terms of his...
Yeah, he's got this great long flowing cloak.
Yeah, and he, like a number of other people at Yale, were interesting from the standpoint of, I think, visual longevity for me. And also, I got along with them. They were nice guys, despite their little run-ins with the New Haven Police Department. They were cool.
Yeah. Well, there's a place where exceptional students go, and exceptional people usually have larger-than-life personalities, and the people around them and the people who are attracted to them as well. I can imagine it was a...
There was actually a man there named Jules, George Jules Taylor, and there's a nude painting that I have of him at the Tate Modern, but that was one of 3 paintings that I did of Jules. And Jules, every time I think of him, I think of a dialogue that I had with him. And I named the painting that, and I'm going to use some colorful language here because Jules is colorful. And he said, one day he was sitting on the couch and I was asking him about jazz. So he says to me, why do you think every nigger from New Orleans got to know something about jazz? Well, I'm from New Orleans, nigga, and I don't know shit about jazz.
That's great.
Then he says, every nigga I knew from Philadelphia is crazy, including you. That was Jules. Wow. And I could not avoid that area of description. Mm-hmm. Jules was actually an Egyptologist by trade.
That's great.
But he was open, and I got along great with him. And he, as I say, posed on several occasions for me.
Fantastic. Yeah.
And he would say, man, why do you always make my glasses crooked? I'm gonna stop posing for you, if you don't do that. I say, Jules, look in the mirror. Your glasses are always crooked. There was a slant there, so. But anyway.
That helps to see yourself as people see you. That's exactly right. And so you also got involved in photography at Yale. I just wanted to mention it because you've had such a long involvement with photography. I read somewhere that you took Walker Evans' advanced photography class at Yale. And so what was that like? And you've obviously brought your camera with you. You're very much a photographer. How did it work with your paintings? Did you take photographs of the model? Did they pose for you? It's, from what I've seen, most of your models physically pose for you, but I think photography had a role too.
Given the change of address and many of the busy schedules that people lead, you can't necessarily have them posing for you when you want to. And I've taken my camera damn near everywhere. And as I was telling you earlier, not only is this a pleasurable sort of situation, but I'm working. Yeah. And the situation with my being introduced to a darkroom was in Philadelphia when I got a studio. The man who had the place previous to me was a photographer, and he had to get out of town quick, and he left all his equipment there. Wow. And I had the opportunity to start a rudimentary area of self-education as far as chemicals and darkroom use and enlargers and that kind of stuff. So it was sufficient enough for me to get into my first photography class at Yale. And once I got into that, the next year, I started to hang out more with the photographers, and I was able to put together a portfolio that I presented to Walker Evans, and I was able to get into his class. And as one could say, the rest is kind of history of sorts. He people would ask, what was Walker like? I said, Walker was cool. He didn't say too much, you know. There again, I said, once you got into Yale, they left you alone, and I brought a body of work that at the time I was commuting back and forth to New Jersey because I was in New Jersey National Guard. And in coming through New York, you would stop off at the Port Authority. And if you know anything about the Port Authority, I mean, there's a whole bevy of images that can be interesting.
Cast of characters to be found there.
So I did a portfolio of the Port Authority, which I found out was not unlike the Subway series that Walker Evans did. And one of the critiques that I remember Walker saying to me was that I was the first person that ever brought him around Tondo photograph. I had experimented, how could I sort of cut this photograph without putting that little sharp needle hole in the middle. And I finally got that perfected, and I brought him an image there. But I had been working with the circles, or I say tondos as it was called, and ovals before I got to Yale.
With your basketball paintings?
Yeah.
That's terrific. And so when you finished at Yale and you went back to Philadelphia, where you began a very successful art career, you had ties to, you showed at Kenmore Galleries and you had ties to Philadelphia while you were at Yale?
No, I didn't go back to Philly.
You did?
I left there. I got a position teaching at Connecticut College. So when I finished at Yale, I moved up to New London.
Right. So that was the direct outcome out of Yale. You got a teaching job and began in professorship. Yeah. Terrific. And so your gallery was showing you in Philadelphia, but you weren't living there.
Right.
Exactly. Okay, great. When now it's been 40 years of a body of work, and we've seen there's been a lot of focus on your 70s work with this show at the National Museum and your recent work, but you're still very much an active, busy painter. You just had a solo exhibition at Jack Chaman Gallery. How does it, and you kind of told us a little bit, looking at Sergio, how did it feel to be reunited with so many of your paintings from your past at the National Museum?
Well, you say that blast from the past.
Yes.
Yeah. Sergio and
here's one of them. But you were in a room surrounded
yeah.
by them, or many rooms. That must have been quite an experience.
Well, as I say, the experience of having them pose for you is a little bit different now that I'm doing a bit more from photographic images because of, there again, as I say, the time and place that I have photographed folks from. I've had a few images where folks were in various foreign places that I couldn't possibly get them to pose for me.
So it was quite a coming of full circle. You came back, and you're having the experience of a traveling exhibition of that stature. Gave a lot of attention to your career. A lot of people have written about you, how you've influenced other artists and so forth. And we're, I think I read about, it was an article in Time magazine, there was a lot of press about you. How does it feel to see kind of your career a validation? How did it feel career-wise for you?
I was going to introduce myself as Kahendi Wiley.
Okay.
But I ain't going to be that facetious.
All right. I was kind of.
However, I've gotten
there.
that on numerous occasions. Right. But anyway, we'll move on from there.
Okay.
But
well,
I'm learning. I mean, there's a comment that you made earlier about my coming back to Philadelphia. Well, as I say, I didn't come back to Philly. I moved to New London, and I would say each move that I made from Philadelphia got to be progressively smaller, from Philadelphia to New Haven, from New Haven to New London,
yes.
and then from New London Center City to my house, which is outside of the city area. So in a place where I think the population is maybe 26,000 from Philadelphia, which is maybe 4 million now.
Yeah.
So there are some areas of the metropolitan influence that I miss. But on the other hand, I have a background from my parents who were both born in Virginia. And each summer, I used to go to Virginia, and as screwed up as the state is, I love Virginia. And being in a situation where there's wide open spaces and you can go out to the garden if you want to and get, watermelon or, tomatoes and that kind of stuff. I mean, that was a good time as a kid. Mm-hmm. See, I used to cry when I had to come back to the city. So New London offers a kind of tree-infested environment. careful they don't fall on your house and stuff like that. And the power lines and cut the power off, which has happened.
Oh,
So there's a respect and love for the smaller areas, although I say I'm back and forth to the city on occasion. In fact, it was about 2 weeks ago we were back in New York for Randy Weston, one of my all-time favorite musicians, and there are exhibitions that I get a chance to come back to.
well, Barkley, thank you very much. It's been a great
My pleasure.
Thank you.